Hey friends, welcome to Cinematic Scripture, where I help Christians move from fragmented faith to story-shaped clarity, so they can see the gospel everywhere and share it naturally. I'm your host, Kyle Harless. Let's roll film. Alright, so we're nearing the end of Season 1, Foundations of Cinematic Theology, why story matters and why theology needs it, and how film can actually become sacred ground. Now, across this season, we have confronted one continuous lie. Film is just entertainment. It has nothing to do with theology or discipleship. So today we're actually going to tackle a specific version of that lie, that film is too new, film is too secular, and is too dangerous to matter to theology. And I think for many Christians, this is more than just an idea, it's actually a felt tension. As believers, we love Jesus. We want to be faithful, but we want to guard our imagination, our desires, and our eyes. But when it comes to film, we can feel this tension that can be difficult to name. Actually, Robert Johnson, he writes in a book, Real Spirituality, he says, Christians often feel caught between fear and fascination. And I think what he's saying here is that we are drawn to stories, yet we're unsure how to engage with them faithfully. Now, maybe you land in one of these thoughts, okay? Maybe you think, look, I don't want to be shaped by something unhelpful. I don't want to be naive or careless. I don't want to baptize everything that culture makes. I don't want to retreat, but I don't know how to engage. And that's okay. That's why we do this. We want to help you. Because I think beneath all of these, there's actually this deeper desire. And it's the desire that we want to be wise, right? As Christians, we want to be faithful. We want to be wise. We want to guard our eyes and our heart. We don't want to be fearful. We don't want to be cynical. We don't want to be passive. We want to be wise. And so if you land there, just know that you're not alone, okay? Christians have always wrestled with the stories that culture tells. And in fact, I think an interesting verse to look at here is Ecclesiastes 1, where it says, there is nothing new under the sun. Film is not the first medium that Christians have feared. It's simply the latest. And theologian William Durrance, he notes this, every new art form has forced Christians to ask, what does faithfulness look like here? The question, friends, has never been whether stories disciple us. The question has been, are we listening with wisdom? And that's what we want to tackle today. Okay, so the issue is that when we call film too new or too secular, we are actually retreating from dialogue and we are abdicating formation. When we call film the enemy and we withdraw from cultural conversation, we're removing ourselves from the table. And we forfeit the opportunity to name the ache, to confront the idols, and to cultivate the wisdom in the very spaces where people already live and learn. And so to understand how we got here, we need to zoom out and look at the story. Now, it has been documented in several books that early Christians didn't start with fear. They started with opportunity. See, churches used to rent theaters for evangelism, and pastors would use silent films to illustrate sermons. And Christian leaders, they shaped early moral expectations for cinema. Film, it wasn't the enemy, it was a tool for witness. In fact, Craig Detweiler, he notes that early Christians saw film as a new pulpit. It was a way to reach people who would never enter a church. The church is at the table, and by the 1930s, the church has a formal seat at the table. In fact, Catholics and Protestants together, the leaders of Catholics and Protestants, they helped shape what was called the production code. Studios would consult clergy, and Hollywood and the church collaborated on moral storytelling to make sure it was appropriate for people to watch. And film at that point was this shared cultural project. And historian Thomas Doherty, he writes that the church wasn't protesting Hollywood at this time, it was partnering with it. But then something happened. We hit post-World War II. After World War II, filmmakers wanted independence. So art began to push into complexity and to critique. And Hollywood wanted freedom from its religious oversight. Paul Schrader, a Christian screenwriter, he argues that post-war cinema actually became a confessional booth for a wounded world. It was the world hurting and coming to confession. And so what happened then is we move into this period where the church began to withdraw and lose its influence. And instead of adapting or dialoguing, many Christians just retreated. And film became worldly, film became dangerous, film became corrupt. And when the church withdrew, it surrendered. It surrendered its influence, its voice, its seat at the table. And Stanley Hauerwas, he calls this the tragedy of Christian withdrawal. As in, it's not that culture changed, but it's that the church stopped showing up. And then this led to this time of Christian alternatives in the 70s, even into the 2000s, okay? In this vacuum, Christian subcultures arose and they created their own films. And family-friendly actually became the metric. And discernment just was reduced to content filtering. Engagement was reduced to avoidance. And James K.A. Smith, he actually notes that when Christians retreat from culture, they often create parallel liturgies. All right, they create parallel liturgies, as in these are like stories that feel safe, but they don't always form us deeply. And then that gets to where we are now, this streaming era. Film is global, stories are instant, and narratives shape imagination at scale. Everyone is discipled by screens. Marshall McLuhan, he famously said, the medium is the message. And friends, today the medium is everywhere. And the church is still in this space where we're deciding whether to engage or to retreat, whether we're going to retreat or re-enter the conversation. But here's the thing, when we retreat, we don't just lose film, we lose people. We lose the chance to speak into their stories. We lose the chance to speak into stories that people connect with, like Oppenheimer, that deals with power and conscience and responsibility, or Barbie, that deals with identity, longing, and meaning. What about Get Out, that has this prophetic critique of racism? There's the film Silence, that deals with suffering and doubt and hiddenness. Or even the film Spotlight, that deals with truth-telling and institutional sin. See, we miss our chance to speak to those stories when we withdraw. And when film becomes the enemy, we begin to stop asking what truth, what tension, or what longing is actually being revealed, and we lose the chance to speak Christ into it. So Ecclesiastes 1:9, there is nothing new under the sun. Film is not a threat to Christian history. In fact, it's part of the long tradition of storytelling that God has always used. See, friends, we have to stop and remember that Jesus used stories. Matthew 13:34 says, Jesus spoke all these things to the crowds in parables. N.T. Wright says Jesus used story because story is the natural language of the kingdom. Jesus would use cultural stories. He didn't avoid them. He would enter them, he would reframe them, and he would redeem them. Peter in Cornelius' house. This is where God speaks through what Peter had believed was unclean. And it actually shows Acts 10 as this turning point in Christian imagination. If you know the story, Peter, he enters a Gentile home. And it's a place that he believed was off limits because he's a Jew and they were Gentiles. But he says, God has shown me that I should not call anyone unclean, impure, or unclean. Kevin Van Hooser, he notes that Acts 10 is a hermeneutical earthquake. I love that language, hermeneutical earthquake. It's God expanding Peter's imagination. Peter discovers that God was already speaking in places that he was avoiding, that the Spirit was already moving in people that he misunderstood, that the gospel was already at work outside of his categories. And God still does those things today. God speaks where we least expect him. Our categories, friends, are often too small, and the Spirit is already ahead of us. God has always spoken through unexpected mediums, and film is not the first unusual medium that God has used. In case you don't remember, God has spoken through a burning bush. God has spoken through a donkey. God has spoken through wilderness and floods and plagues and miracles and trees and crosses and empty tombs and always people. Messed up human people God has spoken through. Hans Belshazzar, he reminds us that God's revelation is theatrical. It's dramatic. It's embodied and surprising. Dorothy Sayers said that the Christian faith is the most exciting drama ever staged. And if God can speak through a donkey, he can speak through a film like Arrival. If God can speak through a burning bush, why can't he speak through the film A Tree of Life? If God can speak through a tree, why can't he speak through silence? See, discernment, friends, is not content filtering. Content filtering, all it can do is tell you how many swear words there are, how much violence there is, and what rating the film is. Content filtering cannot tell you what this story loves, what this story fears, what this story worships, or what this story reveals about the human heart. Augustine once said that all truth is God's truth, wherever it is found. So discernment is not about sanitizing stories, friends. It's about listening to them. If God has always spoken through surprising mediums, and if Jesus in the early church modeled engagement, then the way forward is not withdrawal, friends. It is dialogue. But hear me, dialogue is not just a technique. It's a way of being formed. It's a way of being present, and it's a way of being like Jesus. Stephen Murrell, he wrote a book called Wiki Church, and he gives us language that feels almost prophetic for our time. He says that dialogue is the posture of Jesus. And Jesus didn't disciple through monologue. He discipled through presence, through questions, through shared meals, through listening, through conversations, through story. Murrow goes on in his book to describe Jesus' method as open source discipleship. It's not a download of information, but a shared relational process where people discover Christ together. Listen, I mean, just think about this, okay? Jesus listened before he spoke. Jesus asked questions, often before he taught. Jesus entered people's stories before he reframed and named their ache. Jesus honored the person in front of him before correcting the path that they were on. Jesus spoke the truth with tenderness and authority. He didn't stand at a distance and shout at people's lives. He stepped into their narratives. This is the opposite. Jesus' ministry is the opposite of a top-down, lecture-driven, content-heavy formation. It was relational. It's dialogue. And if that's how Jesus formed people, then that is how we must engage the stories of our world. Friends, dialogue is not compromise. Dialogue is Christ-like, and dialogue is the posture of the early church. There's a Greek word, dialogome. I'm probably butchering that. I'm sorry. I took Hebrew in college, not Greek, okay? But it means, look it up, it means to discuss, to reason, to dispute, or to preach. And it actually appears 13 times in the New Testament, such as Acts 17 and Acts 20. And what this word implies, it implies a two-way exchange of thoughts or a logical argument. It signifies reasoning and discourse. So like in Acts 17, okay, Paul listens to the poets of Athens before proclaiming Christ. He actually uses the poets. In Acts 20, Paul's preaching is dialogue, it's discussion, is exchange. In Acts 10, again, Peter listens to Cornelius' story before he preaches. He goes in and hears their story, and then he begins to share. Now think about that, and let's go back to Murrell in his book, The Wiki Church. He argues that the early church, they grew not because they had the best content, but because they were the most relational, conversational, spirit-led communities. They didn't disciple through monologue, distance, fear, control. They discipled through shared life, through shared questions, through shared discernment, and through shared stories. The early church, they listened, they responded, they discerned, and they engaged. Paul even quoted poets, right? He referenced the altars. You pray to an unknown God. The early church connected the gospel to the stories people already knew. Dialogue is the posture of real formation. Now, let me go back to Wiki Church again. Murrell says discipleship is not top-down, lecture-driven, content-heavy. It is a shared process where people discover Christ together. And that's exactly what films invite us to. Films, they give us shared stories, shared questions, shared tensions, shared longings, shared moments of recognition. And film actually becomes a space where discipleship can happen the way that Jesus discipled. Not as a lecture, but as a conversation. Dialogue, friends, is how we reclaim our seat at the table of culture. It's not through censorship. It's not through control. It's not through withdrawal. But through presence, through curiosity, through discernment, through compassion, through clarity, this is how we regain our seat. This is relational discipleship. This is not passive consumption. This is not fearful avoidance. It is not cultural assimilation. It is attentive presence. It is listening with the Spirit. It is entering the story the way that Jesus entered people's lives. Dialogue turns film into formation. And when we approach film wanting to dialogue, we can begin to see the incarnational ache in Children of Men, the resurrection ache in the Tree of Life, the redemption ache in Arrival, the justice ache in Spotlight. And it's not just in film, television, our long-form cultural storytelling, right? It carries its own theological weight. Think of The Leftovers. It's a raw meditation on grief, absence, and the ache of meeting. The Good Place is a surprisingly rich exploration of ethics, identity, and what makes a person good. The show Lost, let's not talk about the ending, but it's a story about community, sacrifice, and the longing for redemption. The Mandalorian, it's a parable of chosen family, okay? Covenant loyalty and costly love. The Chosen is a reminder of how Jesus met people in their stories before he rewrote them. Severance is a haunting critique of fragmentation, identity, and the cost of escaping pain. And Ted Lasso, man, one of the best shows of the last few years, is a gentle parable on kindness. It's about presence and healing through community. Stories like these aren't neutral. They disciple us for better or for worse. They are shaping what we hope for, what we fear, what we believe about people, and what we imagine redemption looks like. So we can engage film and TV. They can become spaces where empathy grows, where imagination heals, where discernment sharpens, where discipleship deepens. This is where discipleship can become shared discovery. We don't need to come to film with all the answers. We come to it like a conversation. We come with curiosity, we come with humility, and we come with the Spirit speaking to us so we can speak to the story. Dialogue is how we move from fear to wisdom. It helps us move from withdrawal back to presence, from monologue back to shared discernment, from fragmented faith to story-shaped clarity. It begins with dialogue and letting the Spirit speak to us so we can speak to the ache. All right, so here's the invitation. Choose a film this week, just one film, not to judge it, not to escape into it and turn off your brain, but to actually listen and to ask these questions. What ache is the story naming? What longing is the story revealing? And what does the gospel speak into this ache or longing? Questions like these is how we re-enter the conversation. Questions like these is how we get our seat at the table. Questions like these is how we disciple through story. Because when we engage film with courage and clarity and compassion, we can begin to see the world the way Jesus did. Not with fear, not with suspicion, but with a tentative presence. We can enter these stories the way Jesus entered the stories of the people around him. Okay, so hear me out on this. If dialogue is how we move from fear to wisdom, can we just think about what actually changed if we lived this way? Imagine what would shift if we moved to wisdom from fear. Imagine a world where Christians didn't retreat from culture and we didn't baptize culture, but we engaged culture the way Jesus did, with courage, with clarity, with compassion, and with presence. Imagine what would shift if we stopped treating film as a threat and we started treating it as a conversation partner. A place where God might actually already be speaking and already be stirring. He might already be revealing the ache beneath the surface. See, friends, this is the new world we can step into. This is not a program. This is a new lens, a technique, a way of seeing. It's a posture, one that looks a lot more like Jesus than maybe we want to admit. It's a new world of personal faith, where we go from fragmented faith to integrated imagination. I mean, just imagine your own faith no longer feeling split between sacred and secular. You watch a film, and instead of guilt or suspicion, you feel curiosity. You feel discernment, you feel compassion, you feel recognition, and you actually begin to see your own story in the stories that you're watching. You begin to see your wounds, your longings, your fears, and your hopes. And you begin to ask good questions. You start asking, what is this story naming in me? What is this story awakening in me? And where is Christ meeting me in this ache? See, your faith becomes integrated. It's not a set of beliefs that you carry, but it's a story that you inhabit. It's the story of Jesus Christ. I mean, think about families where we'd see shared stories and shared formation. Imagine families who don't just watch movies together, but they actually talk about stories the way that Deuteronomy describes discipleship. Remember Deuteronomy, it says, when you sit at home, when you walk along the road, when you lie down, and when you get up, to think about these things, to talk about these things. Parents asking their kids, what did you feel during that scene? What did you hope would happen? What does this story say about what it means to be human? And kids would actually learn to name emotions, desires, and fears they see in story and connect them to Scripture, to Jesus, and to the gospel. See, stories can become shared language for spiritual formation. The living room can become a classroom on empathy and compassion, and the credits at the end of the film become a doorway into discipleship. This is a new world for the church, where it's a community that listens before it speaks. I mean, just imagine with me a church sermon that doesn't just quote Scripture, but also the stories shaping the people in the pews. Scripture can speak to the stories today, okay? Imagine small groups that they didn't just study a book, but maybe they watched a film together. And they actually began to ask, where is the ache? Where is the idol? Where is the longing? Where is the hope that this story speaks? Imagine a church that doesn't fear culture and doesn't worship culture, but actually discerns culture with wisdom, with tenderness, with courage. A church that listens before it speaks. A church that enters stories before it actually critiques the stories. A church that practices the posture of Jesus. This is relational discipleship, Formation that happens through shared discovery, shared questions, and shared presence. A church like that becomes a place where people feel seen, they feel heard, they feel known, and are invited into a better story. This is what Jesus did. And just think about a new world for our communities. Imagine communities where Christians are known not for their outrage or their withdrawal or even their suspicion, but for their attentive presence. Imagine Christians who can sit with someone's story, even if it's a messy story, even if it's a painful story, even if it's unfamiliar. They can sit with it and they can say, "Friend, I hear you. I see your ache. Let's walk through this together." Friends, I actually believe that film can train us to do this. Film can teach us to sit with characters that we don't understand, to feel with people that we would never actually meet, to enter worlds that are not our own. And that practice of doing that with film spills into real life, where we become slower to judge, we become quicker to listen, we become more patient when there's complexity, and we become more courageous, filled with compassion. And that leads to a new world of evangelism. Just imagine evangelism that doesn't begin with a script, but begins with a story. Maybe there's a coworker who mentions a show they're watching, or a neighbor who talks about a film they just watched, or a friend shares a scene that just hit them emotionally. And instead of pivoting to an argument, you enter the story with them and you just ask good questions. That's interesting. What did that stir in you? What part of that felt true for you? What did you hope would happen? And then suddenly, you're not debating. You're not setting up a defense for Christianity. You're naming the ache. You're listening for the longing. You're discerning where the Spirit is already at work, which is what we are to do, to partner with Christ, to partner with His Spirit. In evangelism, honestly, it becomes less like a sales pitch and more like the Emmaus Road, walking with someone, listening to their story, and then letting Christ reveal Himself along the way. This would be a world where Christians sit at the table again. Just imagine a world where we are invited to the table, the cultural table, not to control, not to censor, not to withdraw, but to witness to a better story. Imagine filmmakers and writers and artists and teachers and pastors and parents who engage culture with theological depth, with emotional intelligence, with narrative wisdom and Christ-like presence. Imagine Christians who can say, "I heard your story, I saw your ache, and I have a story to share with you, the greatest story ever told." Friends, that is the new world. It's a world where Christians don't fear stories, but we discern them. We don't avoid culture, but we engage with culture. We don't retreat from the table, but we sit at the table with humility and hope that our light would shine bright. It's a world where discipleship is a dialogue formation, it's relational, and the gospel is seen everywhere because we have learned to look for the gospel. This is the way back to dialogue. This is the way back to our seat at the table, and this is the way of Christ. Hey, thanks for going on this journey with me. If today's episode stirred something in you, will you consider liking it, leaving a review, and sharing it with a friend? And if you are ready to learn how to dialogue instead of withdraw, if you are ready to return to the way of Jesus, the way of presence, compassion, and discernment, if you are ready to stop feeling fragmented and to start living with clarity, then I want to invite you in to see the story of 5-Day Awakening. It is not more Christian content. It is a new way of seeing, a way of engaging stories the way Jesus engaged people. And if you're sensing a pull towards awakening, towards clarity, towards a story-shaped life, then see the story as your next step. You can learn more at cinematicscripture.com. Until next time, I'm Kyle. Watch attentively, reflect spiritually, and lead from story. I'll see you next time.